Good evening. I'm Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to a very special program that we're having tonight. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land in which I am speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for tonight's discussion, and they are the Edmonton Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. Tonight's event is a special one in the sense that it's a book launch for a remarkable new book that was published yesterday. The title of the book is The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No. This is a book about whistleblowing. It's not necessarily clear in the title, but this is a book about whistleblowing and about whistleblowers who exposed research that directly harmed human subjects. But tonight's event is also a conversation about the issues in the book, a conversation between two people who are exceptional scholars, researchers, physicians, and teachers. Two people who, for me, personify what it means to be ethical and courageous in the face of overwhelming opposition and often relentless retaliation. One reviewer captured the book better than I could, so I'm just going to quote her. And she wrote about the book, a brilliant, harrowing book, part medical investigation, part memoir, part searing portrait of human behavior. Carl Elliott has written a page turner that manages to be both cynical and deeply compassionate, urgent, unforgettable, and beautifully written. I'd like to introduce the author, Carl Elliott. Carl grew up in Clover, South Carolina, went to university and medical school there, and then at Glasgow University in Scotland, training first in medicine and then in philosophy. He had postdoctoral positions at Chicago, Otago, and New Zealand, and the University of Natal Medical School in South Africa. Then he taught at McGill University in Montreal before going to the University of Minnesota in 1997 to join the Center for Bioethics. He is currently a professor in the Department of Philosophy. In addition to his books and scholarly articles, his writing has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, amongst many others. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Carl will be joined in conversation with Nancy Olivieri. Now, I had a problem writing a short introduction for Nancy, somebody I've known for, I guess, Nancy, what is it, 25 years?
25 years, yeah.
Yes. Nancy was born in Hamilton, Ontario, did her undergraduate work at the University of Toronto and her Doctor of Medicine at McMaster, and then trained in internal medicine and hematology at McMaster, Toronto, and Harvard. She is professor of pediatrics, medicine, and public health sciences at the University of Toronto, and senior scientist at the Toronto General Hospital. She is one of the world's leading authorities on thalassemia, a serious blood disorder affecting more than 1 million people globally. And as the University of Winnipeg has stated, and I quote, Dr. Olivieri is widely recognized as one of the preeminent crusaders for academic freedom in our times. A crusade that began after her research found that a new drug for which she had had high hopes to be a breakthrough treatment for thalassemia patients turned out to be anything but. And when she advised the university, the Hospital for Sick Children, and the manufacturer that she had to report her findings in the scholarly literature and medical literature and advise the patients in the drug's trials, she faced denial and vicious retaliation for years, all detailed in a superb book written by John Thompson and colleagues titled The Olivieri Story. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Well, we're delighted both of you are here, I can tell you. Now, for the audience, what we're going to do is Nancy and Carl are going to have a conversation about many issues related to whistleblowing in medicine. And if you, while you're listening to them talk, have any questions that you would like to ask them, issues you'd like to have them take up related to tonight's topic, you'll look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So you just click on that Q&A button at any time you want to ask a question, write it in there. Don't wait till Nancy turns to the audience for questions. Just record your questions there. And Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the Center for Free Expression, will read out the questions in sequence when we get to that section of the event. So please do ask questions. Both Nancy and Carl will welcome them, and I suspect will provide superb answers. So that's all for me. I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. Well, Carl, you're not going to like this because I didn't get enough time to talk, so I'm going to talk, but I'm going to talk about you. And
Great.
I just have to
Fantastic.
let me later here. Okay, sorry. So I'm more than glad to be here. I'm really delighted to be here. I can tell you why I'm delighted to be here, even though it's a serious topic and it's somewhat, as you said, a tough book. As you've heard, Carl's a philosopher. He's an author who's brought a distinctly courageous voice to this subject. But he's also an ethicist, one of my favorite topics, in the real sense of the word. And in 1996, an ethicist named Benjamin Friedman wrote an article called "Where Are the Heroes of Bioethics?" And he made the point, I don't know Benjamin Friedman, but I'm sure Carl does. And he himself has written about that essay. And Carl has written, Benjamin Friedman's point was that in a job that presents many opportunities for heroic action, there seem to be remarkably few known examples. One would imagine that bioethicists committed to social change would be constantly clashing with structures of authority. In 1996, Friedman couldn't find any examples. In writing about this years later, Canadian ethicist Professor Françoise Baylis, in reference to my own case, identified the very few heroes of my story, only one of whom, Arthur Schaeffer, was a bioethicist. But Carl is a hero, a bioethicist, as well as an author and philosopher. Even though the opening sentence of his book says, let me present my credentials as a coward, his own whistleblowing experience was long and grim and brave. So his book is not only written by an expert, but by an expert witness. But before we go to Carl's outline and how he was inspired to write The Occasional Human Sacrifice, I want to say that Carl has been a personal inspiration to me. You know, when you speak truth to power, you lose most of your friends. You also become, as Carl has written, unmoored from the many aspects of your life that once gave it meaning, about which we'll hear tonight. And for 25 years, when I was going through that, many years before I met Carl, every time I reread his books or articles, he would ease that isolation. I also would think, every time I read something that Carl had written, I would think, good, I'm not crazy. When Carl writes about clinical ethicists who are not activists, or about the corruption of character in medicine, or about deadly pharma-managed clinical trials, it feels personal and inspiring. But you don't have to be a whistleblower to feel a deep solidarity with this brilliant book. Another reason I look forward to reading everything Carl has written is not only that he could not write a bad sentence, which is actually a little irritating to those of us who try to write a good one, but that in the middle of Carl's most grim paragraph, I find myself laughing out loud. So on that moderately upbeat note, Carl, let me turn over the mic to you and say thank you for being here and congratulations. We're all anxious to hear about your book, but I think we also want to hear about how your experience led you to writing it. And just before you answer, because you think I've actually stopped talking, no, I haven't. I'm going to start by introducing this by saying, I sent this paragraph to one of my oldest and my longest supporter, Professor John Dick, last night. And I'm going to read it to you. It kind of illustrates a part of Carl, and he's too modest to read it himself, so I'm going to read it. And this is Carl writing in giving a presentation about the case he was embroiled in at the time, the Dan Markinson case. When I was invited to give a grand rounds lecture on ethics in the Department of Pediatrics, I included a short discussion on the Markinson case, hoping that other faculty members would find the facts as upsetting as I did. But when the very first question was asked, I realized how badly I had miscalculated. The audience was outraged, but not about the case. They were angry at me. The question and answer session felt like what sociologists call a degradation ceremony, a public ritual designed to humiliate offenders and deviants. When it finally ended, I packed up my laptop and walked up the aisle toward the back of the lecture hall. No one would meet my eye. I remember fighting an intense desire to go back to my office, crawl under my desk, and open a bottle of Jack Daniels. It was 9 a.m. I said this to John yesterday, and I said, remember those days? And we very much do. So anyway, let's start, Carl, with, even though you think you're a coward, can you tell us how you got into writing this book?
Yeah, that was a dark time.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Well, so I could tell you the long version and the short version, but probably best to go with the short version.
Okay.
So the short version is that I kind of self-immolated at the University of Minnesota after pressing the university to investigate the suicide of a young man named Dan Markingson, who was a mentally ill young man, delusional, paranoid, threatening violence, who was essentially coerced into a drug study at the University of Minnesota in our Department of Psychiatry under the threat of involuntary commitment. Basically, they put him under a civil commitment order. He was on a locked ward, and then asked him if he would volunteer for this study, which was sponsored by AstraZeneca. Now, he was clearly not competent to make any kind of medical decision. He was on a locked ward. He was under a civil commitment order requiring him to obey the recommendations of his psychiatrist. And his mother, the only family member he had, was objecting to him being enrolled in the trial. She pointed out all these things, pleaded with him not to put him in the trial, and they just said, look, he's an adult. He consented. And she spent the next 4 months or so desperately trying to get him out of the trial, calling, emailing, turning up at the Department of Psychiatry, writing letters, just warning again and again, if somebody doesn't do something, he's getting worse. He's going to kill somebody, or he's going to kill himself. And eventually that's exactly what he did. He was living in a halfway house, and they found his body in the bathtub with his head nearly cut off, with a box cutter beside a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. Now, I read about this like everybody else did in the newspaper, in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. It was a fantastic series by Paul Tosto and Jeremy Olson, two reporters for the Pioneer Press at the time. But I was sort of horrified by the whole thing. I was actually on sabbatical in Cape Town in South Africa at the time. But when I got back, I thought, I should look into this. I was kind of stunned that I'd never heard about it, because this was, by this point, it was 2008, so 4 years after he had killed himself. And, I just thought, I work in the bioethics center at this university. I work on psychiatric ethics. I've been on the IRB. A guy, in a clinical trial commits suicide, and his body's found in a halfway house shower. How did I not know about this? But then when I got home, nobody really seemed to, it didn't seem to be as upset about it as I was. And I spent probably about a year and a half before I realized I wasn't going to get anywhere with the administration. So I eventually wrote about it for Mother Jones magazine.
Yeah.
And by that point, there had been new information about AstraZeneca that had come out as a result of a federal lawsuit against the company for fraud. And it turned out that there were a number of other antipsychotic studies for their drug, Seroquel, that were clearly rigged to give a good result for their drug that were leading back to our Department of Psychiatry. So I wrote about those two things together, the suicide and the fraud from Mother Jones, thinking I could shame the university into doing something about this case. And that was a huge miscalculation. The only action that prompted was action against me, you know. And, you know, from there followed, you know, about 5 years of kind of desperately trying anything that we could to get an outside investigation. And, you know, we eventually did get one by the Minnesota State Legislative Auditor. And it found pretty much all of the things that those of us who were working for it knew already. There was coercion, there was corruption, there were conflicts of interest, there was a cover-up, there was malpractice. And, you know, it was a brief embarrassment for the university, but after about a year or so, it was clear they were not really going to do anything about it. And then at that point, you know, sort of, what do you do? What do you do?
You write about this in your book, about the deflation that one feels when you for sure think you've nailed them to the cross and then it's not there. It just all slips away.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about the Republican, that inspiring basketball coach, or should we leave the subject? I mean, I wish he was in my sport.
Let's go back to that. You're talking about Arnie Carlson, the former governor. Yeah, but let's leave that for a little bit.
Okay, well, that was really, thanks a lot for that really uplifting story, Carl. We always feel better about that now. And I guess I know that you don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I actually would, it's a fantastic introduction to everything that can go wrong. I felt like I was living in the University of Toronto for a while. I'm going to ask you a question about well, I guess the first question is, it kind of leads from what you said, is the universities and the academic institutions and the authorities and everybody. I often talk about this. I teach a class and everybody thinks I'm a hardened cynic who is highly critical. And I say, show me one university. I think you have shown us in your book, one university that ever did the right thing, that ever listened to the whistleblower, that ever said, thank you for identifying this. Do you want to talk about university and academic, especially because we're talking about academic fraud, resistance to being told the thing, to not doing the right thing? Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. I mean, so this was part of the question I had after, you know, what seemed like just years of futility and failure.
That's because it was futility and failure. That's why I felt like it. Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, I guess I kind of wanted to know, how does it usually play out? I mean, is the University of Minnesota a uniquely terrible institution, or are all academic research institutions terrible in the same way? And so I actually, well before I started working on the book, I started teaching a class on research scandals. And there are way more scandals in our class than there are in the book. There are only a handful in the book because there are really only a handful of whistleblowers. That's one thing I found, is that in most cases where something goes wrong in a research study, there are no whistleblowers. Doctors, nurses, study personnel, IRBs, university administrators, they all know what's going on, and they just watch it as patients are being harmed and exploited and deceived, and they don't say anything, right? That's the norm. When the scandals do come out, if they ever do make it into the press, it's not by virtue of whistleblowers. It's usually by virtue of victims or victims' families going to the press or going to an attorney or going to an oversight body of some sort, or some combination of those. But the remarkable thing is that you're right. Institutions never do the right thing. I don't have any examples of them doing the right thing. They always stonewall the press. You know, they always retaliate against the whistleblowers. They always do as much as they can to protect the researchers, and they do whatever they can to avoid apologizing or compensating the victims. The only time anything good happens, it's because the institution is forced to make that happen from the outside.
You don't think there was an exception in the unfortunate experiment? I mean, it seemed less violently opposed to conceding the point eventually.
Well, again, that came from the outside. Auckland University. So I should explain a little bit.
Yeah, that one's
So,
a good one to explain.
This was, most people in North America don't know about the so-called unfortunate experiment at Auckland National Women's Hospital in Auckland in New Zealand, but everybody in New Zealand knows about it. I mean, it is the probably the single most traumatic and maybe even notorious event in New Zealand medical history. It started, I believe, in 1966. It was an experiment, the so-called unfortunate experiment, in which women with cervical cancer in situ, a precursor of cervical cancer, were left untreated for decades, and many of them went on to get cervical cancer and die.
Poor story. Jesus.
And so, it eventually, there were 3 whistleblowers in that case. Bill McIndoe, Jock McLean, and Ron Jones. Ron is the only one who is still alive. He's the one I interviewed for the book. Now, it took them forever. Like, they worked years and years, particularly Bill McIndoe, trying to expose this and trying to stop it. And it didn't stop until they published an article in 1984 that was picked up by the press, by 2 journalists writing for Metro magazine. Now, the encouraging part of this story is that with that Metro article, which was, fantastically influential, with that Metro article, there was public outrage. There was a judicial inquiry. All of the victims were given a voice. It happened, within months of the Metro article. It was front page news for like 6 months. There was a report that was produced. The victims were compensated. The researchers and people who helped cover it up were sanctioned. And there were these long-lasting reforms instituted by the New Zealand government to their research oversight system that, have largely prevented anything like that from happening again. That's sort of what you hope for. But, I should say, I don't think Auckland University has apologized even now. So there was, I think, if there is a happy ending in the book, a positive result as a result of a whistleblower, that would come as close as any I can think of. But still, it was forced on the researchers and the institution from the outside, and National Women's from the outside. It wasn't voluntary in any way.
So here we are. We've got, in fact, that story, you are not a vengeful person like I am. So you did not focus on the person who actually did that experiment, but we'll leave it.
I'm just not as open about it. I stew on it, but I'm definitely as vengeful, for sure.
Really? Okay, I don't think so. But you know what? I have a few of my relatives you can speak to if you want to. Anyway, the thing is that so the whistleblowers in those cases, what happens to them is something I thought, of course, happened to only me. And that's why all the writing that you've done over the years is intensely comforting. It should be actually more disturbing than it is, but it's intensely comforting, because then you think, oh, good, I'm not alone. So tell us the insights. Tell us everything you think about why Ron Jones did that, or why Bill did that, or why Peter Buxton and the Tuskegee experiment, the one that haunts me, because I was going to university the year that dissolved. That's how up to date it is. And everyone knew about it. Anyway, I don't want to get way ahead of the story, but can you tell us a little bit? We can't go into every case, but more generalizable about whistleblowers and what happens to them.
Well, it doesn't work out well. I mean, I think, I think the picture the sort of optimistic picture that people get from popular culture is a kind of David and Goliath story.
Yeah.
And, I think people internalize that in a way. And they think, and, you'll hear a version of this kind of story from the people who blew the whistle on wrongdoing. They will say, I just assumed that if I blew the whistle, everybody else, once they found out about it, once they knew what I know,
Same.
they would be just as outraged as I was. They assume, some authority is going to leap into action. They assume their friends are going to stand by them. They assume that, they'll be seen as having done the right thing. And none of these things are true, right? Very often their friends don't stand by them, and the authorities don't leap into action. And instead of being celebrated, they're vilified. And that is like profoundly disorienting. It's almost a kind of existential collapse because, everything that you thought about the world, all of the values that you sort of have built your life around and that compel you to do what you've done, turn out to be wrong. So then what do you do? How do you go on from that? And that was the interesting thing to me about a lot of these stories. So you suffered about as much retaliation as anybody that I can think of. And there's some people, in the book, like, for example, the Karolinska Institute whistleblowers, they were reported to the police. So they had to go down and be interrogated by the police, and they were threatened with firing. John Pasando.
Oh, don't start with John Pasando. That is the worst. That is just the worst. It's the best example. Go ahead.
I mean, John Pasando blew the whistle.
Know the story a little bit, Carl. Tell it.
Okay. All right. I can talk about John, who I think of as a kind of heroic figure.
Too.
John is an oncologist and immunologist who had gone to work at the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center in Seattle, and was asked / forced to join the IRB, which he really didn't want to.
Institutional Review Board, which reviews.
Institutional Review Board. So research ethics committees. I forget, is it REBs or REs?
Yeah,
research
in
ethics
England,
boards.
in Canada, it's REB, but in
REB, right.
Institutional, yeah. And
when he was on the IRB at the Hutch, he found out about this experimental bone transplant, in which people with leukemia and lymphoma were being given, put on this protocol where they would get an experimental type of bone marrow transplant instead of the standard treatment. And by the time he'd gotten there, it had been going for a year or two. I can't remember, but it was not going well. He became increasingly alarmed by it. The graphs were not taking, and subjects were dying. And often these were subjects who had 50, 60, 70% chance of complete cure on the standard treatment. And they were being put in this, on this experimental protocol without being told how horrific the success rates, the death rates were on it. And they were just dying. And he eventually was taking care of a couple of these patients on the ward. Anyway, he kept raising objections. He kept getting blown off. It looked as if even his fellow allies on the IRB eventually gave up. And the study went on for, I believe, 12 years. And he lost his job. I mean, he went there with the expectation that this was going to be a permanent job for him. And after 5 years, he was just called in and said, it's not working out. We're letting you go. And he was unable to work as a cancer researcher ever again. I mean, he spent the rest of his career with the Social Security Administration reviewing disability claims. I mean, this is a guy, you have to look at his CV. this is a guy who was at the very top of academic
Yeah,
medicine.
yeah,
You're talking
yeah,
Harvard, Penn, MD, PhD,
yeah.
Albert Einstein, Dana-Farber, assistant professor at Harvard. And as soon as he got to the hutch and started objecting to this trial, his career was essentially finished. Those are the kind of risks that that whistleblowers are taking, and I think a lot of people just have no idea. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see I took the epigraph from something that John said to me the very first time I met him,
Yeah.
which is every whistleblower is an amateur playing against professionals. I mean, you have no idea what you're up against. Most people just sort of stumble into this terrible situation without any idea what they're doing, and before long, their life is ruined.
Worse, they're confident that people will believe them. In this case, also, a Nobel laureate, the guy got the, so I'm just going to, the person who fired him, the person who engineered this whole protocol, went on to win the Nobel Prize. And that's also what angers me, is the rewards offered the people who keep their mouths shut and continue to rise, as John was never given the chance. That is the sense, I think, that contributes to a lot of the anguish for a whistleblower, is that people who keep their mouths shut succeed. And it turns on the head anything you really, as you said, believe about right and the arc of the moral universe, bending toward justice and blah, blah, blah. And then when you realize that, people then think you're actually terminally cynical, and you just want to say, you run into social media all the time. People say, we really have to stand up for what's right. And I just think, right, try doing that. In my case, we had a better outcome than most. John Pasantos is haunting because, for all the reasons you said, and also for the people who went on completely unencumbered by killing these people.
Well, I mean, for John, it's even worse.
Oh,
I
good.
shouldn't
I
say
thought we'd actually hit
know,
the bottom, but good. We're still going
it didn't
down.
just
Okay.
end with being fired, because the thing is, he didn't give up.
No.
By virtue of reading a book about monoclonal antibodies, he learned that there was enormous conflicts of interest that were driving this clinical trial.
Yes.
And he spent another decade, 15 years or something, trying to get oversight bodies, the federal government, reporters, anybody interested in this case. And he was just relentless about it. And then he finally did convince reporters at the Seattle Times.
That's a great series.
David Heath and Duff Wilson, who are both terrific reporters. He did a huge series on it. Fantastic job. It eventually led to a lawsuit and an investigation by what's now the Office of Human Research Protection, who had a different name back then.
Right.
And none of it succeeded. The lawsuit failed. The OHRP investigation failed. With one exception, the victims got nothing. And now it's all completely forgotten. I mean, that's about as bad an outcome as you can get. Like, you get fired, the victims get nothing, and the researcher wins the Nobel Prize for medicine.
Yeah, I think that wins it. Actually, that's the prize. That's the prize in your story. Jesus. So I'm thinking about John Pasanto, actually, and thinking of that dogged 10 years, 20 years. So why do people, you got to give us some insights here. I don't even know if I have any insights into my own behavior, or yours, but what distinguishes the whistleblower now from the person who walks by and says, oh yeah, that protocol really didn't work so well, I guess. Well, what distinguished John Pasanto? What was it?
This has been a question that people with a lot more expertise in psychology and sociology have been asking for decades, right? How do you distinguish the bystanders and the whistleblowers? Is there some sort of personality characteristic? Are they particularly moralistic? Are they particularly difficult to get along with? Are they particularly religious? You know, there must be something about them. And nobody, I mean, if you look at that research, none of it is convincing at all. And so I definitely don't have an answer to that. I do have some observations, you know, about the people that I talk to. I'm not sure they're generalizable, right? Because I only, you know, I looked at 6 cases.
Yeah.
Right? And some of those had a handful of whistleblowers. So I'm not sure this is a representative sample, right? But one thing I did find, I mean, I'll tell you one thing that I was not entirely expecting to find because of the reputation that whistleblowers have. And believe me, I've been you know, because I write about these things, I'm approached by whistleblowers a lot as well.
Right.
The reputation that whistleblowers have is that they are uniquely prickly, sticklers for the rules, difficult to get along with, people who just don't really care that much about how they're seen by other people.
Crazy.
I gotta say, I didn't find that at all. Every single person I talked to in this book, I liked. Often, a lot of them I liked a lot. I find them really funny, very dark, very easy to talk to. You know, all of which was tremendously reassuring. The one thing that I will say is that with a lot of them, there's a kind of contrarian streak. You know, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say this is their distinguishing feature, right? But there is a kind of a willingness to challenge the status quo. But the main thing is that they're all very stubborn people. Now, that said, I'm not sure that stubbornness is a characteristic that leads to whistleblowing. What I will say is that it is a characteristic that allows people to keep going, and other people who would blow the whistle will stop, right? So one of the people that I talked to, actually, this is the very first interview I did a long time ago, is Peter Buxton.
Oh God, you've got to tell that story and give the background to Tuskegee, which has haunted me since I was a kid. Just a little bit.
The Tuskegee syphilis study was a 40-year study by the U.S. Public Health Service in which poor Black men with syphilis in Alabama were studied and deceived and lured into this research study in which they would get no treatment for their illness, even after syphilis became easily.
So the point is, when it started, there was no penicillin. So fair enough. It's an observational study. Okay, for the first 2.5 minutes.
There was treatment. There were these arsenic-based treatments.
Arsenic and mercury,
which were unpleasant.
Yeah.
But the guy who invented them did win a Nobel Prize. So it's not as if it was, completely ineffective, right? But yeah, so by the early 1940s, 1943, I think, easily treatable with penicillin. And the U.S. Public Health Service still didn't treat them. The story Peter tells, Peter's at this point, he's a kind of a young graduate school dropout who had moved to San Francisco to become a syphilis tracker for the U.S. Public Health Service in San Francisco, right? And the way he tells the story is he was in the coffee room. He's only in his 20s at this point.
Wow.
He's in the coffee room and overhears a couple of people talking about this case in Alabama of this guy. He had advanced syphilis. He was an older guy. He had neurosyphilis, obviously symptoms of mental illness. And his family had taken him to the doctor who had treated him with penicillin. And that was the standard treatment for neurosyphilis at the time. And later, he'd gotten a phone call from the researchers at the U.S. Public Health Service saying, "What are you doing? You can't treat this guy. He's in our study. He's supposed to go untreated." And Peter just overheard this conversation about it in the coffee room. He's like, that can't be right. You know, I spent like my whole job is to
Wow.
go out, find people who have syphilis, and to keep them, you know, for their own safety and to keep them from infecting somebody else, bring them in and convince them to get treated. That's what he did every day. And so when he hears that his employer is intentionally not treating these people, he decides he has to find out. And he calls up the U.S. Public Health Service headquarters in Atlanta, what's now the CDC, and asks for their files. And they send him the files, and he reads them. He's like, it's true. They've been doing this for decades.
And allowing it to progress to neurosyphilis. Let me just clarify that. Allowing it.
Allowing it to progress to death.
Death and
I
insanity.
mean, this was the thing that, he said, they wanted these people dead on an autopsy table, right, because they were offering them burial insurance to enroll in the study, right? They didn't tell them they had syphilis. They said, you have bad blood. And, if you'll let us autopsy your body when you die, we'll pay for your burial insurance.
Oh, so great. Yeah.
So, Peter spent 7 years trying to get that story exposed from 1965 to 72. Now, the thing that people don't realize about Tuskegee is there were other whistleblowers. There are people who tried to object earlier. A couple of people from outside the U.S. Public Health Service, and then a guy who worked for the U.S. Public Health Service, Bill Jenkins. What distinguished Peter was that he just refused to give up.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is one thing that, at least with the people who sort of made, I hate to call them successful because almost all of them consider themselves unsuccessful.
Right.
But at least made it to the point where I know about the research abuses, right? And other people know about the research abuses. Often they have to be prepared to stick with it for years or even decades. And a lot of people are just not built for that, I don't think.
And there's no clue as to there's no upbringing background, or there's no past history of decisions in the family, or family history of oppression, or, stuff that a non-psychologist would think it's got to be there somewhere.
Well, I mean, so every one of them is different. So, for example, like the prototypical whistleblower is somebody like John Pasando, or I would say, the three cardiovascular surgeons and intensivists who exposed the Macchiarini scandal, right? The prototypical thing that the story of whistleblowers are people who are on the inside and find themselves in a situation not of their own making in which they feel compelled to stop somehow. But that's not every case, for example. Like the whistleblowers at the Willowbrook hepatitis study. Again, a horrific, a scandal of almost unbelievable proportions. This massive 6,000 plus patient institution on Staten Island for intellectually disabled children. Just an absolute snake pit in which one piece of the many horrific abuses inflicted on these kids was many of them were enrolled in the hepatitis program, in which they were intentionally infected with hepatitis A and hepatitis B. Now, the whistleblowers there, I mean, there are really two. The main guy I talked to both of them, but one doesn't consider him, Bill Bronson didn't consider himself a whistleblower. But they were both activist sorts, right? So this is the early 70s, Vietnam War. They're in the U.S. Public Health Service as physicians training in Staten Island, mainly to avoid being sent to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And there is a collective that has been organized there of all kinds of like-minded kind of leftist activists, social justice advocates working there, working with the Black Panthers and working with the Young Lords, and they called themselves the Frantz Fanon Collective.
Oh my
And
God.
a lot of them lived together in the same house. Now, Mike Wilkins and Bill Bronston were not assigned to Willowbrook. They went there voluntarily. Mike says because it looked like the kind of place where bad things would be happening. And so he went there voluntarily, and they thought, we're going to go in there and organize the doctors to reform this place. And what they found is no doctors were interested in that. They just get out of here. And the same with the nurses, the same with the staff. And they eventually started to organize parents by sneaking them back onto the wards and letting them see the horrors that had been hidden from them. Now, that is not the typical, and eventually Mike got fired. He went to a reporter. There was this fantastic, nauseating film called The Last Great Disgrace, which if you watch will make you cry.
Yeah.
And, that set into motion the things that eventually led to the shutdown of Willowbrook many, many years later. But that's not the typical story. Activists going into a place trying to reform it. The typical story is people just finding themselves in a situation where they feel as if they have to act. They kind of wish they had not been placed in this situation. But now that they're in it, they feel as though they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't do something about it.
It's so puzzling. I remember saying to my right hand, Gary Brittenham, they're not going to be able to sleep at night. This is the other people. And he said, they're sleeping just fine. You're the one who's not sleeping. That's the kind of thing I don't get, is the people, the doctors at Willowbrook, people who rubber stamp Tuskegee, the people in my case, at the Hutch. And these guys, I found myself envying them, their life, all living together, being, the Frantz Fanon. So tell us about how you got through, and maybe if you don't want to do that, just tell us a little bit about solidarity, because you and I have talked about this for a lot. And in my own case, out of the 700 plus people that could have helped at the hospital for sick children, there were about 10, of whom 4 ruined their lives for 25 years for me. And it wasn't even their disease. It wasn't their patients. It wasn't their trial. Barry Sherman wasn't, suing them. At least I can't remember. I think they got other lawsuits, but there were so few of them, but it was enough. In fact, it was more than most people have. I think about them every single day, and I wanted to know what you thought. Do you think that's what rescues whistleblowers? The Willowbrook people had such solidarity. We had solidarity, a lot of it. We were together all the time.
To me, this is like the main. If I could emphasize one thing about the book, the one sort of, it's not exactly an uplifting book.
Yeah, no, for sure. Pretty
demoralizing.
Yeah.
But one of the surprising things that I found, I guess I should not have been surprised because it was my experience too, is that there is, part of the cultural myth around whistleblowers is a kind of solitary figure taking down the organization. But once you start to dig into it, you find that very often it's not a solitary figure. It's a whole group of people working together. And so, some people understand this right from the beginning. So I think of Bill Bronston, Mike Wilkins, Dave McClanahan, Elizabeth Lee, the Frantz Fanon Collective members. They understood it very well at the beginning. The Karolinski Institute whistleblowers understood this very well at the beginning. They made a conscious choice, we're going to work together. Martha Stevens, who I haven't mentioned, fantastically smart, entertaining, and courageous activist whistleblower at the University of Cincinnati, an English professor. She was working with a group called the Junior Faculty Association. And again, another kind of activist group. This is Vietnam era studies. And, you know, for me at the University of Minnesota, I was kind of, you know, I guess I was sort of the, you know, the public face of this, but in fact, it was also Lee Turner, my colleague in the Bioethics Center and my friend. It was Nikki Jerry, who was a nurse at Fairview Hospital, who had actually been on the wards when Dan Markington was coerced into the study. There was a group of faculty senators at the university who were on our side. And then there were people like Trudeau Lemons at the University of Toronto at the outside, or like you, you know, who were kind of not there at the university, but, you know, providing support and working, you know, in the same futile, demoralizing cause.
Yep.
So
loser causes, that's what we're good at. That's
yeah.
right. Works.
And now maybe this is the time I can tell my Arnie Carlson story.
Oh, this is great.
That's one of my, you know, so, I mean, I've got to say that at the University of Minnesota, Lee and I were trying everything that you can imagine that it was possible to try to get some attention to this place. Like, you know, we were filing complaints. We were filing complaints to the FDA, to the OHRP, to the Office of Research Integrity, to our IRB, to our Research Ethics Consultation Service, to the Attorney General of Minnesota. Like, we wrote to donors to the university, trying to get leverage with them. We had protests, we had vigils, we had petitions. I gave so many talks, you know, I can't even tell you how many, and nothing worked. You know, I wrote so many letters to Minnesota's a very progressive state with a lot of progressive politicians that I, you know, thought would help with this case. Nothing, got absolutely nowhere. And then I read an editorial in the paper by a governor that I didn't know about, really. I think he'd actually been governor when I moved to Minnesota, but for a very short period of time before the new one came in. His name was Arnie Carlson. He had been a Republican governor, and he was writing about his outrage at the high salaries that the administration at the University of Minnesota were paying themselves, right? And you know, he was asking why, you know, why does the president of the University of Minnesota make more than the governor? Why, you know, why does he make more than the president? You know, why do all these administrators make more than the faculty members? And he was calling out the very people that I was doing battle with at the university, you know, the president, the deans, the general counsel, all these things. And I just thought, you know, this guy hates the same people I hate. Maybe he'll be congenial, you know? And I wrote him an email having no idea that he would respond. In fact, I sent him the same email that I've sent to several other people, you know? And surprisingly, he wrote back almost immediately. And he said, what do you think we meet for breakfast? Yeah. And he said, all right, meet me at Perkins in Golden Valley on Wednesday at 8 o'clock. And if you're not from Minnesota, you probably don't know what Perkins is, but it's like Denny's, you know, it's like this, you know, it's in a strip mall out in a suburb. So I'm thinking, all right, that's where the governor meets, you know. So, you know, I drove out there and, you know, I spotted him. He's there alone, kind of in a booth with a bunch of papers, you know, and coffee, kind of hunched over like Humphrey Bogart, you know, at the bar in Casablanca. You know, so I go up and I talk to him. And, Man, he is not, I have to say, I've gotten to be very good friends with Arnie, but he was not that friendly at the beginning because he didn't know who I was.
Yeah,
I sent him a
sure.
bunch of material. I sent him the Mother Jones article and so
Yeah.
on. But he kind of grilled me at the beginning. And I think he wanted to know if I was credible or not, you know, or if I was completely deranged,
Right,
which
right.
I could have been.
Yep.
But after we talked for a little bit, he started to warm up, and he's very funny. He's very sardonic, and you know, and very dark. And you know, after a little bit, I was like, I kind of like this guy, but I wasn't sure that he liked me. And so after a little bit, we had breakfast and we're drinking a lot of coffee. And eventually, I drink a lot of coffee, which means that you have to go to the bathroom a lot. So I sort of excused myself to go to the bathroom. And when I was coming back, I heard this voice, and it was like, Carl. I kind of look around, and it's Carl, and there is sitting in the booth just a few away from us is a guy I know from the University of Minnesota. His name was Paul Quee, and I knew him, one, because he's a kind of a legendary figure at the university, very, kind of kind-hearted, altruistic pediatrician.
Hmm.
But I knew him because he had been involved in setting up the Bioethics Center back in the 80s. And so, he's like, what are you doing here? And I said, believe it or not, I'm having breakfast with the governor. And he goes, oh, that's funny. I am too. Have you ever met my brother, Al? And I was like, oh my God. His brother was another former governor. He'd been governor, I think, in the 80s. And, Arnie sees me over there talking to him. He comes over and he's like, Al, what are you doing here? And, they know one another and they're slapping each other on the back. And suddenly, I feel like I'm in, right?
Yeah.
Because of Paul Quee. Like Paul knows me. And, we went back and finished and talked a little bit more. But by the end of it, I felt like I think he's on our side. It seemed like he was. And man, I'm telling you, he was. I mean, he threw himself into that battle like you would not believe. And he is an enormously respected person in Minnesota. I've got to say, I did not understand how beloved he was by a large proportion of the population, because he's blunt and known for decency, and also because he was a huge friend of the university when he was governor. Probably the greatest friend that the university has ever had in the governor's office, as far as I can tell. Even had his governor's portrait taken, in a University of Minnesota, golden gopher jacket, right? And so when this guy starts coming out and saying the entire senior administration of the university and all the board of regents should be fired.
Oh,
this is the worst scandal in the history of the university. People kind of sit up and listen. And I should also give him credit. If I had known that this is, is how it's done.
I know.
Again, amateur playing against professionals. We had no idea what we're doing.
Right.
Arnie's a professional. He knows how politics works. He was in the governor's office for 2 terms. And it was really him and his backing and his working with the legislature that got the legislative auditor's report that eventually vindicated us. Now, again, small comfort, that legislative auditor's report.
Yeah.
But it was way better than no vindication at all. And
it's better than John DeSanto's result. Yep.
Yeah.
Wow, what a story. Is he still around?
Yes. I was just in touch with him recently. I sent him a copy of the book.
Oh, great. He's going to love it. He's just going to love it. Jim's been signaling me to ask a question. So I'm supposed to ask Ange if we have any questions. I don't want to break because I want to, but maybe we should let the audience ask you some questions, Carl. Ange, do you have a question?
Yeah, there's quite a few good questions from that.
Oh, okay. Are you going to read them, or are you going to make me read them because I can't read them without my glasses?
No, I'll read them out loud.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
Okay, so we'll start. The first question is from Bill, and Bill says, he asks, is there a real general concern about universities conducting drug evaluations for pharmaceutical companies generally?
Okay, you
Drug-
know what?
Oh,
Forget about Carl. He just wrote the book. Let me answer that question. Oh, sorry, they wanted to ask Carl. Go ahead, Carl. What the hell?
No, go ahead.
No, I'm joking. You go ahead.
No, I'm serious. I mean, yeah, this is something that we're in complete agreement with.
Yeah,
Yes, there are
sadly.
huge problems with it. I mean, uh, so I mean, I
Was
should,
that the rest of,
I should.
was there anything more to the question, Ange? I'm sorry.
yeah, there was actually. Bill had some comments after that. He says drug companies have a financial conflict of interest in compensating universities to conduct the studies. They pull the universities and researchers into these financial conflicts of interest. Or is this just a case of a few bad apples? In food and nutrition research, systematic reviews have found that findings of industry-funded research skew heavily in favor of companies' marketing objectives compared to independently funded studies. This seems indicative of widespread systematic capitulation. And that was
Yes,
the end.
I mean, all I can say is I agree with that completely. And the case at the University of Minnesota, which was antipsychotic marketing, what what you find basically, there have been meta-analyses of these studies exactly like the one that Dan Markinson was in, and what you find is in these comparative phase 4 studies in which one antipsychotic is compared to another, in 90% of cases, whoever funds the study wins. So if AstraZeneca is funding the study, then Seroquel beats Zyprexa and Risperdal.
Yeah.
But if Lilly's funding the study, Zyprexa wins. Right?
The thing that I would say to Bill is that it's now not just funding, it's the companies run the trials. When we started, we'd think up an idea, then we would argue about the primary endpoint, and then we'd write the grant and apply for money. I know this sounds like a fairy tale, but now they come to this is why clinical research is such a loser pursuit nowadays, because the pharma companies dream up the study, they dream up the primary endpoint and the research approach. They actually give you the slides that you're going to present at the end. They have to be in their colors, so you can't even put your own colors in, but they manage everything. They have the CRFs, the clinical research forms, so you don't get a look at everything. If you're in a multi-center study, you only get a look at your few patients. And that's not the real thing. That's just pharma managed research. Lots of people have written books on this, and there's no transparency. And then we're left with, of course, saying idiotic things like I used to say, like, well, the FDA will save us, and the FDA won't save us because it's conflicted as hell. And we're not, it couldn't be, Bill's kind of answered his own question, which is absolutely, the conflicts of interest are right up there until the regulator. And do you have another question?
Yeah, so the next question, an attendee asks, are some patients left to suffer unnecessarily in order to observe development of adverse effects from medication?
Sometimes, I mean, that was exactly the case with the Dan Markinson case. There were financial incentives to keep subjects in the study as long as possible. And of course, if you're under a commitment order in which you're dependent on the researcher to lift the order, then you really, getting out of the study is, even harder, right? So I don't know. Do you have something to say about that, Nancy?
Well, I would say that, not, it's mainly in psychiatric studies where these adverse events are not concealed so much as reframed. And that's why the famous study, the infamous study 329, that classified suicidal ideation as something else, or suicide as something else. It was, of course, a completely ghostwritten study, for pharma, but the actual endpoints of the study are altered so that you won't know that these patients actually suffered, and in some cases died. So I don't know if the question is focused on something like Tuskegee, are people left I don't know of any example of that, but I know the psychiatric studies are misleading. It's kind of a wimpy term for they're lying. And
Yeah, the next question from David. David asks, how do you protect yourself and your family and friends from the hazards of orthodox medicine while still taking advantage of the potential benefits?
I think you should answer that one, Carl. I think it's really, I don't want to do all the talking. Jesus, that's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not in a position to, to answer that with any competence. My standard answer is, find a clinician that you can really trust. Try to look at unbiased sources of literature. I'm a big fan of the Public Citizen Health Research Group and their worst pills, best pills evaluations, the medical letter. I mean, there are various places that you can, I think, are more trustworthy than others. I am generally way more skeptical of pharma-funded trials than I am of federally funded trials, which is, that said, there was Tuskegee, and Willowbrook, that was a federally funded trial. Like a lot of the trials that I write about in the book were actually federally funded.
Yeah.
But there is not this, the thing that you have to understand about pharma trials is that there's an enormous amount of money riding on how the trial comes out, which means there's a sort of constant, relentless pressure to rig trials in order to produce the results that you want, to bury trials that are unfavorable, to play up trials that turn out the way that you want. Which is not to say that every pharma-funded trial is not to be trusted, but you just have to understand that there's this enormous financial incentive that is always there, leading to making them untrustworthy. Right.
It occurs to me that maybe a helpful resource to the person who asked that question is a book called Forbidden Knowledge by our colleague Terrence Young, who wrote a book 25 years ago called Death by Prescription. But the most recent book he wrote was published in 2023, and it actually directly answers that question. Forbidden Knowledge, Dundurn Press, Terrence Young. I'm not making a pitch for it. I mean, he's a close colleague and he's taught in my class, but this is a very important book, and it's written for the lay reader about how to understand drugs and what to do when the question that was asked is posed. And
yeah, the next question is from Jenny. First, Jenny says, such gratitude for both of you. And the question, given what you know now, what do you believe would create meaningful accountability in systems where there is such abuse of power? If you were given a magic wand today, what one change would you make?
I was thinking something in terms of a joke, in terms of murder, but I don't want to talk about murder. It'd be really tasteless, but go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I'm not. Here's the thing. So my book is all about academic medicine, right, and academic medical institutions. None of the stories that take place in there are in the corporate world, or some in the government world, but mostly academic medicine and government-funded academic medicine. The thing you have to realize, though, is that a lot of the things that we have been saying about whistleblowers and the way whistleblowers are treated are not unique to academic medicine. You see it everywhere. I mean, whistleblowers do not fare well in any kind of institutions. There's almost a kind of reflexive, reaction against somebody who turns against the group. Now, I do think that there are certain things about academic medicine that make it unique and that make it worse. at least compared to some other kinds of institutions. And one of the unique things, it's not totally unique, but I mean, you have to think of academic medicine as being a little bit like the military, and a little bit like prisons, right? Because it's very authoritarian and it's very hierarchical, right? And this, these things make it harder, should I say? They make it less likely that people are going to speak out, because there is this sort of natural reluctance to speak out against the people who are higher in the hierarchy than you are. So that's one thing that makes academic medicine, particularly difficult. The other thing is the kind of moral mission that academic medicine, medical institutions kind of feel as if they have. Which kind of makes them different, I think, from a lot of corporations, right? Because it is part of the central dogma of academic medicine that the people who work there are on a righteous mission to make the world a better place, right? And making the world a better place does involve taking care of patients, but really the big picture is about academic research, right? It's about medical research, the humanitarian enterprise, always advancing knowledge. And that, there's this sense that this is something that other people just don't understand. People on the outside, they don't really understand what we're doing here. And, when something goes wrong and you're convinced that you're doing the Lord's work, then that produces, this sense that someone is getting in the way of your righteous mission, and you are morally justified in whatever you do to stop that person, to discredit them, to fire them, to report them to the police, to do whatever needs to be done, because what you're doing is so important.
Yeah, that was particularly evident in the Karolinska Institute. It was like reading. It really is a page turner, that chapter. The whole book's a page turner, but that's a hard question to answer, because I think it's two questions. It's the hierarchy that Carl's described, and the patriarchy, and the the Hippocratic Oath said you'll honor your teacher as your father or your parent. But there's also the pharma reforms, which are long and complicated to talk about. I guess I would have said, put all the data up on a spreadsheet so that you can see if I'm hiding it. And that's a real short answer to a lot of many recommendations that others have made, because pharma can hide the data if it's transparent. I'm sorry to have to cut that one short, because we should go on to the next question. Sorry. Ange?
Yeah, the next question is from David Hutton. And David says, what I'm learning from this excellent discussion is that medical institutions behave ruthlessly towards whistleblowers, just like governments and corporations. Yet many people expect better behavior from medical institutions and professionals. Why do we seem to expect that they would be any more ethical?
I guess the two of us don't, but go ahead, Carl, because
Yeah.
the
Well,
philosophical.
the idealistic vision of this is that medicine is a profession, that it's not a business, and that part of the mission of medicine, the moral mission of medicine, is that you put the interests of patients first, right? It's not just kind of buying a service from someone, and you're looking for a fair deal. The whole idea is that doctors are going to put your interest before theirs, before their financial interest, before the interest of the institution, before their interest in promotion, tenure, Nobel Prize, whatever. And so I think that the actual belief in that is what propels, or at least part of what propels, some whistleblowers to speak out, right? There's a certain amount of idealism that's involved in becoming a whistleblower, right? it's hard to, I'll just have to take the people, the whistleblowers that I interview, I just have to take their word for it. Because by the time I talk to them, they're all very jaded, right? But the standard whistleblower story is, I can't believe I was so naive. I was so idealistic back then. And part of that idealism is, that doctors will behave a certain way, that they will sort of be led by the highest ideals of their profession, and so on and so on. And that, the world, the moral arc of the universe does bend toward justice. And then, when they blow the whistle and they're treated with such contempt, that's incredibly disillusioning, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I forget where I was going with that.
Well, I think you were going to say, or well, I don't know what you were going to say, but I think the direction was that we believe better. And that's the question implies we believe better of these individuals. Perhaps there's a time warp there, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that a lot of whistleblowers themselves believe the same thing.
Oh, for sure. I believe
Yeah.
nothing else. I was really convinced. I think your paragraph is really fantastic. You didn't expect to be treated with scorn or eye rolling. And I was convinced I would be better than that everybody would say, oh, well, yeah, no, that's a problem. After all, in my case, it was numbers. It was a certain, anyway, the point is, it really doesn't matter about the details of the case. It matters that I expected to be believed.
I mean, there's a story that one of the Karolinski Institute whistleblowers told me that, it kind of stuck with me. The Matthias Corbaccio, who was one of the cardiovascular surgeons, and what he was describing the sense of blowing the whistle was like. He said, he lives in Sweden now, but he grew up in California. His mother was Swedish, and so he went to medical school there and is settled there. But he said, when I was in high school in California, a friend of mine got caught with cocaine in his car, and he told everybody it was mine. And he said, I was like 17 years old, and I'd never done cocaine before. It wasn't mine. And he said, I just remember that feeling of being wrongly accused, right? And he said, that's what this feels like, right? It just totally destroys any illusion that you have that there's some kind of justice in the world.
Yeah. That's a, Carl, I don't want to send you into a royal panic, but we have 22 questions. So drink that Jack Daniels down. And our next question, Ange.
Yeah, the next one is from Ruth. And Ruth says, even before the whistleblower enters the picture, what about IRB members? Having served on my institution's IRB for 38 years, I voted no on many occasions with my reasons. Sometimes the colleagues joined the opposition. One or two members of the IRB voting no when 25 members approve. The IRB system enables everything you describe.
Yeah, no, I've got a lot to say about IRBs. I became very disillusioned with one of the first IRBs that I was on in McGill. Now that I think about it, and had that same experience of being voted down at one meeting after the other, after which the IRB was just dissolved. So in this class, I teach this class on medical research scandals. And it's just like scandal after scandal after scandal for a whole term. And every one that we look at, every disaster, every death, every one of those studies was approved by an IRB or something similar. In the States, the IRB system didn't come formal IRB system didn't come, until, forget when they started being called IRBs, like the 80s or 90s. But most institutions, even before them, had some kind of human subjects review committee or departmental committee or some kind of peer review committee. And in every case, when the study had gone before those committees, they had said it's fine, right? This is the big problem. I mean, there's so many problems with IRBs, but one of the problems for anybody who comes across misconduct in a clinical trial, human subjects are being abused. The question is, well, who do I report this to? And really, the place to report it is the IRB. But then what you find is that the IRB is complicit. I mean, they're on the side of the institution. You very rarely get any kind of satisfaction by going to the IRB, which has already approved this study and already may even know about the abuses that you're talking about, and has done nothing about them. So then the question is, well, where do you go after that? And that was our problem. You try the FDA, you try the Office of Human Research Protection, you try all these other sort of outside bodies, and you get nowhere, right? The way that our IRB system is set up, and it's the same in Canada, there is a built-in conflict of interest, because what you have is faculty and staff members reviewing the research of their colleagues, and sometimes their friends, and sometimes their superiors, right? It's not the kind of impartial, objective, external review that you really need. And the alternative that we've come up with that is a paid for-profit, review board system, which has financial conflicts, right? This is one of the intelligent things that New Zealand does. There are a lot of things that Kiwis do that are so much smarter than we do here in North America. One of the things they did in response to the unfortunate experiments is try to get rid of those conflicts of interest, move the review outside of universities themselves. That would be a good start. Not a finishing point, but a start anyway.
Ange?
Yeah, the next question from an attendee, they ask, did whistleblowers seek help or confirmation of what they saw from colleagues before reporting the wrongdoing?
Yes, almost always, actually. I mean, if you look, for example, at the unfortunate experiment, when that, this is the one where women with a precursor cervical cancer were just watched and not treated. The very first meeting, the departmental meeting, you had Bill McIndoe raising his hand and saying, you can't do this, and he was just ignored. And he and then joined by Jock McLean and then joined by Ron Jones, they spent years trying to get the studies stopped internally. It was the same for Peter Buxton. His first thought was, I'm going to go to my superiors in Atlanta, and he got nowhere. Typically, it's the last resort when you go outside the institution. That seems like a big step, right? You haven't gotten anywhere on the inside. You've had this sort of Frank Serpico moment where you realize that everybody that you trusted is actually in on the crime. And then it's only then that you start to think about, where do I go outside the institution to get some sort of help?
Ange?
Yeah, the next question is from Warren. Isn't it clear that a sense of fairness is inherent in human consciousness? It isn't something that needs to be taught. Isn't this ultimately what underlies whistleblower action? The relevance of whistleblower varies from the enlightened of the person blowing the whistle and the power structure she or he challenges, but the underlying psychological mechanism is the same: do unto others, which is part of every spiritual or moral ethical teaching.
I'm not really sure I'm on board with that one. I mean, there's nothing there that I really disagree with. I think the the difficulty is imagining that the problem is all a matter of moral judgment or knowledge. There's so many other things going on. The big thing going on is, as John Posando said, if you're the only one in the room who thinks that something bad is happening here, at a certain point you start to wonder, am I really the only one who sees anything wrong here? And it takes a certain amount of, I don't know, self-confidence to just insist that you are correct and everybody else is wrong, right? So that's one issue. The other is just this whole issue of power. You never find, the people with power are never the ones who blow the whistle. It's always the people on the bottom or people in the middle somehow. And it requires, if you have any sense of how these things work, you have some knowledge that it's going to blow back on you. The other thing is that I think everybody knows that speaking out against the group is going to make you very unpopular. Even if you don't think, if you don't it never occurs to you, oh, I might get fired or reported to the police. You understand just by reading the room that you're becoming a problem if you're the only one in the room saying there's something wrong with this. You're being extremely disruptive and you're rude, right? And a lot of people don't want to do that. Yeah, I could go on at length about this, but I'll stop. Let's take another question if we can.
Another question.
Yeah, the next question is from Carolyn. Carolyn says, Carl, how would you respond to the proposition that no one should participate in pharmaceutical trials, period?
Well, I mean, the problem is that that's the large majority of trials. I mean, if you, I think I would rather phrase it a different way. Like, to be honest, I would not myself. Unless there was some kind of desperation or an unusual circumstance, I would not myself or advise anybody in my family to take part in a pharmaceutical industry trial. But if everybody did that, then we would have, no more trials, right? To get better drugs, you need trials. What we need is a better way of doing pharmaceutical industry trials, right? This is, another thing that I would like to say about solidarity. And this is, I'm sympathetic with these kind of questions and with these kinds of actions. But the kinds of questions and actions I'm thinking about are things where people say, what should I do, right? How do I protect myself? And the thing is, we're never going to get anywhere that way, right? The only way we're going to get anywhere is by having a large group of committed people acting together. If you look, this is one of the things that that comes out in the whistleblowing cases in the book. What you'll find is that the cases where there is some measure of success, maybe not with that case, but in the long term, Tuskegee, the unfortunate experiment, Willowbrook, what you find is that there is a larger social movement that the whistleblowing is a part of. So with Tuskegee, you had the civil rights movement going on. This was an abuse. This was a racist trial targeting poor Black people. It took place, or at least it was exposed during the civil rights movement. It was exactly the same in New Zealand, but it was the women's movement. You had all women being treated at an all-male hospital, and it sort of piggybacked on this larger women's movement in New Zealand that was taking place in the 1980s. You could tell a similar story about Willowbrook. That became a kind of rallying point for the disability rights movement. The problem is that the vast majority of clinical trials don't have a larger, whistleblowing cases, abuses, and so on, there is no larger social movement. But to have any kind of success, that's what you need. It can't be just a matter of a whistleblower working alone, or a patient trying to protect themselves, or victims speaking out about their own abuses. All these things are important. But if you need some kind of progress, you need solidarity, you need a movement, you need people working together and sort of making common cause.
That's a really great analysis. And I think we're probably going to have to end on that. Jim, am I right?
No, that's very encouraging. And this is supposed to be a demoralizing conversation.
You're right. It wasn't demoralizing. At least that last answer wasn't. And Jim, I better call you in, or you're going to freak out at me because I'm taking us into 9 o'clock. Thanks, Carl.
Well, the two of you were terrific, and the audience was terrific. Gee, so many questions. I apologize to the audience. We weren't able to get through all of them. But, yeah, we can't keep you here all night. So,
but Carl's answer is the answer. It's not how
right.
I protect. Anyway,
I mean, that was a perfect. In my view, that was a perfect answer to end this. I think really engaging session. So, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you, everyone.
Tomorrow, the video of this conversation is going to be posted on the Center for Free Expression website, along with a list of resources for those of you who want to read more about these things. There'll be references to some of the articles and material that Nancy or Carl spoke about, as well as other readings about these issues if you'd like to learn more. But if you have friends or colleagues or people in your network who you think might have enjoyed this conversation this evening, you just go to the website and send a link to them. The website is cfe.torontomu.ca. I'm sorry, you were saying something, Nancy?
No, that's great. That's just what I wanted to know.
So also at the website is a list of our upcoming events, as well as all of our past events, from which there are a number on whistleblowing and related topics, and including secrecy in medicine. Anyway, so you can find all those on the website under events. Next week, our next event is a week tonight, same time, 7 p.m., entitled AI Goes to War. It's looking at the use of artificial intelligence by military and what that can mean. It's a conversation. Our guest is Lucy Suchman, who's a professor emerita of anthropology, science and technology in the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University, and author of a recent commentary entitled The Algorithmically Accelerated Killing Machine. She's going to be in conversation with the host of our whole series of events that we've had on AI, Brendan McPhail, who's the Director of Executive Education for the McMaster University Public Policy and Digital Society program. So that's next week, May 22nd, next Wednesday, 7 p.m. And for more information on this, again, go to our website, cfe.toronto.mu. I'm sorry, .ca, torontomu.ca. I'm tongue-tied now. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It was an engaging.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. That was fantastic.
It was fantastic. Thank you.